I'll start with events that began to occur when I was dating my first real girlfriend, back when I was in my early 20s, about 7ish years ago. My girlfriend had always told me she was haunted, and at the time, I was much more of a skeptic than I am now. Our apartment was on the top floor of a small building. There were only 3 stories, and 4 apartments per floor. Weird stuff had tended to happen around the apartment from time to time. Most notably, a picture that we had hung on the wall always seemed to fall off its hook with some level of regularity. I chalked it up to it just not sitting on the hook very well, but sometimes we'd come home and find it quite far across the room, sitting on the floor, which I couldn't explain. We also had 3 cats at the time, and they all seemed to, at different times, stare at the same corner of the room, of the ceiling. They would sit there for long periods just staring into the empty corner. These things were weird up until this point, but things got far creepier. One night, my brother and his then time fiance, now wife, came over for a visit. My sister in law claimed to be very strong spiritually, and she and my girlfriend decided it would be a good idea to play with a Ouija board, which I'm sure I don't have to tell you it's a bad idea for the inexperienced. My sister in law and girlfriend were able to make contact with something that answered questions that I asked that neither of them could possibly know. I wanted to test to see if they were messing with me and my brother. I asked what my recently passed grandfather had told me before he died. The correct answer. I, who was working as an EMT at the time, asked about a patient who had died that none of them ever knew about. Correct answer. At the time, I was understandably creeped out. The board even accurately predicted some future events that have come and passed. It told us that my patients followed me around for some time after they passed, before they moved on. I also said that the corner that the cats were always staring at was the place in our apartment where the spirits of my grandfather and girlfriend's mother congregated. Unfortunately, it was the stuff that happened in the months and years after we had played that were truly unnerving. From that night on, things escalated. The first thing was that the picture on the wall began falling off with much greater regularity and travelled much further. One day, while sitting in the living room, the picture flew off the wall and landed completely across the room. We were so startled that we stopped putting the picture back on the wall and left it leaning on our fireplace from then on. Being that we lived in an apartment, the hallway light outside of our apartment was always on, and looking at the front door at night, you could see the light from the hallway shining under the door. One night, we started noticing that you could see 2 breaks in the light, like someone was standing right outside our door. We investigated many times, trying to figure out what was going on. We moved everything away from the door, thinking it was just our doormat. It was still there. We opened the door several times, thinking maybe someone was actually out there, but the hallway was always empty and quiet. We even tried sneaking up to the door very quietly and peeking through the peephole, thinking maybe someone was pranking us. We never saw anyone or anything. The worst part was that the shadows came and went. They weren't always there, but became so regular that at night, if I had to go to the bathroom, I'd make a point of not looking towards the door, because I didn't want to see if whatever it was there. The fire alarm system in the building at that time started to go wonky as well. We had lived there for a year before we used a Ouija board and never had issue, but after that night, the alarm for the whole building would randomly start to go off in the middle of the night, but wouldn't shut off until the fire department showed up and shut it off. They came to the door after the 3rd or 4th time it happened and asked if we were alright. We said yes and asked what was going on. He said they had no idea, but the system kept on getting activated for no reason. Cupboard doors in our kitchen would open on their own, and our Google Home would start talking to no one and say things like, "I can't do that," when no one had spoken or even made a noise. One time it even made a really loud and strange squeaking noise. After that, we unplugged it and never plugged it back in. While I was working out of town for a while, my girlfriend was finishing her last year of university. We would text all day and video chat at night. She told me on 2 occasions that something had woken her up and she couldn't explain. Once, she said she was woken up to the sound of someone clapping, once right behind her head. She was so scared she froze and didn't move and didn't roll over to look out of fear. The second time, she said she was woken out of deep sleep by the sound of a woman screaming in her ear. She was terrified, and I felt so helpless because I was at least a 9-hour drive away. A couple years later, we broke up, and I'm now living alone in a townhouse. By the way, not the first time I've lived alone, in the town close to the main city. The previous tenant went through some hard times, became unable to pay their rent, and ended up basically fleeing the house in the middle of the night. They must have left some bad energy behind. From the first night after I moved in, I found that there was a weird energy to some of the rooms, and the main floor made you feel unwelcome and uncomfortable at night. It makes you feel anxious when you're down there alone. It got to the point where I wouldn't stay down there at night. I'd go up to my room and stay there all night. I thought for a long time that it was just me being scared just because I was by myself in the house. That was until I started dating my next girlfriend, who said that she felt the same way when she was down there at night, even when I was home. She's quite a spiritual person and actively does spiritual practices. She felt the house had a frightened energy about it, like imagining the energy of a scared child, which was exactly how I would describe it. The last major thing to happen was about 2 or 3 months before we moved out. We were sitting downstairs on the main floor watching TV. My girlfriend was sitting on the other couch and had her hand hanging down when she said that something cold passed her hand. She sat up and put her hand out and said it was like a cloud of cold air, and it was moving. I put my hand out and felt it. It was like running your hand through cold fog. We followed for about a minute before it disappeared. We never experienced anything like that again. Since moving, nothing strange or unexplained has happened, knock on wood. I'm now a firm believer, and I've had the skeptic scared right out of me. About 3 years ago, I had my first experience with an incubus, or so I feel it was. I was in a bedroom with my door open to the hallway. I had a deep dream that I was chained to a bed, in a place I've never seen before, and I was being, well, you know. Anyway, I woke up to my clothes down and my butt in the air, and it was still happening, just in the actual bedroom. Honestly, I couldn't stop. My head was clouded, my back felt hot, and at that moment, the only thing I could think was just let it happen. Now, I wrote it off as just a mind thing. Though I felt this feeling of being followed for a while, as well as being cuddled up to at night, the feeling of being held almost as soon as you hit the bed, something checking your stomach, kissing you, and the pure energy of jealousy radiating when interacting with others is just questionable. It happened again at least 3 times during my first move in the same year. I'd tense up. The middle of the night, I felt a ghost around me, breathing in my neck. Not even sexually, but just there. Then other nights, I'd have the pure force of my hair being yanked back and being kissed and groped, as one would say passionately. I'm a bit thick, but when those arms would run underneath, I felt my weight drop underneath me, like a person would feel when being lavished by a strong human lover. The other night, I experienced the strongest version of this. I felt like a tossed salad, but strangely, in a good way. I couldn't move even if I wanted to, because I felt purely intoxicated. Again, I felt that weird stomach checking. My stomach indeed did feel weird, but it felt like something was constantly rubbing my stomach. The next day, whenever talking to someone, I felt that jealous energy pass by every now and again. In a way, I almost fell into it. I talked to my roommate, who was also spiritually inclined. She told me she almost experienced something similar the same night. I honestly don't know how to feel about that. I have someone who experienced it. It makes me feel less like I'm talking out of my head, and it's nice to hear. But can anyone give me advice about this? How should I go about it? My other friend told me to just say no, and when I basically told them to get the fuck out the last time, I literally got a string of bad, like in 2 seconds. Wasps, spiders, centipedes, stuff falling. I think that was around the time my crystal went missing all alone in one night. It was weird. I grew up in a house that my parents still live in. I'm 31 and have a daughter of my own who's 3 years old. When I was a little kid, I remember having a dream of seeing a little girl in my parents' room. Spent my childhood scared of my parents' room and being alone in the house. By my late teens, 3 or 4 people had said they'd seen or heard things in that house, including seeing a little girl. I still to this day have night terrors about the place and the little girl, so I don't know if it was a dream I had when I was little. A few years ago, my parents had a house fire and the place had to be renovated. During the renovation, the builders reported taps being turned on and sounds and so on. Fast forward to yesterday morning, visiting my family with my daughter, and she always plays on the stair lift going up and down the stairs. Then it went quiet for a minute or two while we all sat downstairs. I walked up the stairs to check on her, and she was walking along the landing, chin shaking, a big bubbling lip and teary-eyed. I said, "What's wrong?" And she just kept saying, "I want to go home." I carried her downstairs and managed to calm her down with my family. I thought she might have caught her finger in the door or the cat swiped at her. I said, "Do you want to show me what happened?" She nodded, and we walked upstairs. She walked to my mum's room and pointed at a teddy on the floor and said it jumped on her. She seemed convinced, and no one put the words in her mouth or had mentioned anything paranormal around her while we were there. I didn't want to keep on at her and scare her, but as soon as she said she wanted to go home, I knew something spooky was up. I don't like going in there anyway, and now even more so. I've never really told anyone this story, other than my wife. A few years ago, I decided to get into funeral work as a part-time gig and see what it was like, possibly doing a career shift into that line of work. Called a few in the area, and only one wanted me to come in to talk. Drove to this funeral home, and of course, it's the oldest, creepiest one in the area. The director came out, and she was super pleasant and actually offered me a part-time job helping out. She puts me on a 1 week on, 1 week off schedule for helping with the actual funeral services and also removals, picking up a recently deceased person. My first removal call was around 11:30 at night. I was nervous to say the least. I show up to the home and she's waiting in the removal van with the cot. She tells me we're going to the hospital morgue to pick someone up. We get there and she goes through the motions teaching me the process, moving the body from slab to cot, buckling them, wrapping them, and away we go. Get back to the funeral home and wheel him into the prep room. I helped her move him on the table and said she wants me to help set his facial features. Not going into detail, it's a little intense for me. After we finish, I'm at the sink washing my hands, and the phone on the wall turns on speaker mode, dial tone, then nothing. After the phone started making these weird, slow, pronounced sounds, I looked at her and she said, "Okay, that's enough for tonight," and we left. 2 days go by, and I come back in to help dress this guy into his funeral tux. Again, the phone does the same thing. I asked if that phone ever did that, and she said it hasn't. Next day is the funeral service. We get everything prepped in the church, then everyone is showing up. The minister was going on about this individual and his time in the military. He said that this guy had stuff to do with Morse code type things. The director looked right at me like a light bulb went off, and it dawned on me. Holy shit, that phone sounded like it was doing Morse code. I'll never forget that, and always wondered if and what he was trying to tell us. One day back in 2013 or so, I was out riding my bike in Las Vegas, where I lived at the time, looking around for people with horses so I could ask them to help work their horses. Clean stalls or teach lessons. I lived right off the strip in a motel called Manor Suites. Right there was Warm Springs, and so I started my journey there. There are several horse properties in the area, and one of the very first I ran across was very close. I saw a nice long house, and in the back, which was clear to see from the road and stretched back, were horses. I rode to the side of the house on the street, and saw they had a full set of horses, one in each stall. I looked around, hoping to see someone, and as I was about to give up, I saw a little girl. She was wearing old-timey clothing, and her hair was braided so perfectly in two braids down the side of her head. Her hair was red, and she was pale-faced and freckled. She had a large cowgirl hat, bandana around her neck, and the rest of her was denim, jacket and pants with brown boots. I spoke to her, and she seemed almost frightened. I asked if her parents were around, and she said they weren't there anymore. I figured she meant they were out at work. It was a weekday, and roughly 1 p.m., so likely they were still out at work. So I asked if she needed help with the horses, and she shook her head no, and said I'd come back later to talk to her parents when they came back. She just shook her head yes, and walked back in the already open tack room door. Now this would never have caused any alarm if I never went back, but I did. And I met the owner of the property and even worked with her horses and did lessons for her clients for a few years. And I met both of her daughters. They were both blonde-haired girls who looked nothing like the little girl I saw. I thought for the longest time it was just a client I was talking to. Like, yeah, her parents were gone because she didn't live there. Her mother dropped her off and that's what she meant. Makes sense, right? Well, one day after a few months, I remembered that little girl I spoke with, and I asked the owner about her to see if she was a client I kept missing for some reason and never saw. And when I brought her up, the owner looked me dead in the face and asked, "You see her too?" I was confused at first, thinking she might be a neighbour's kid coming over and doing things on a property without permission. But the look in her face made me realise she wasn't furious. She was terrified. She then begins to tell me she's had people come over before to talk to her about her daughter, while both of her daughters swear they never talk to anyone. And this red-haired child would be seen by people. She then told me not to mind her, and she shook her head trying to forget I had even mentioned it, and it was the last I spoke to her about it or brought it up. I've lived in my flat for 2 years with my partner and daughter, and weird little things keep going on. My new personal favourite being the glass Yankee candle lid that I put on the carpet moved several inches across the floor in front of me and my partner. The strangest being that my partner dropped his ring on the bedroom floor between us as we were standing opposite from each other. We heard it drop, saw it on the floor and left it there and thought, we'll pick that up in a minute. We finish talking and both go to pick up the ring, but it's not there. We scour the room, looking in places that it couldn't possibly be, but it couldn't be found. After weeks of looking, it still could not be found. Anyway, during a thorough tidy-up, I grabbed my daughter's carrier bag of felt pens and debated just chucking them out, but thought better of it and went through the bag. Lo and behold, the damn ring was in there. In a different room, in a bag of pens that hadn't been touched in months. And no, my daughter didn't do it. My daughter's doors turn on, as do the lights, and we don't dare pop out without keys as the front door has managed to lock somehow. The front door is the type where it's impossible to lock yourself out. Someone has to turn the knob on the inside handle. One night, our cat, new to our family at the time, was insistent that me and my partner wake the hell up. I was talking to the cat, asking politely what the hell he wants so badly at 4 a.m. Out of ideas as to what he wanted, I asked, "Do you want to go out?" The fire escape is his balcony. I hear a very deep and to the point, "No." And no, the cat can't talk. The last biggie was when I was in the kitchen with my partner having a chat. I'm by the door and he's on the other corner of the kitchen. I feel a hand brush up the front of my shoulder area as if to say, "Excuse me." I freak out a little and dive next to my partner and tell him what I just felt. He kind of laughed it off until the box of tea on the side, close to where I was standing, moved across the side. Things move about quite frequently where I live, but we're used to it now. My maternal grandmother, we'll refer to as Elle, died when my mom was just 16 years old. My mom actually wound up losing both of her parents in '83 to cancers. Her father was a prick, her words, not mine, and was unfaithful to my grandmother on multiple occasions, causing them to split. My mum was distant with my grandfather and very close to my grandmother. Surprisingly, her relationship with her is much like ours. Fight hard, love hard, but always have your best interest at heart. It was an accident. My mom doesn't like to use the term oops baby, but well, we all know I was one. I'm the youngest of three, ruled by my older sister and even older brother. My brother looks remarkably like my maternal uncle. My sister looks like my paternal aunt. And I look like my maternal grandmother, Elle. I've always felt connected to Elle, despite never getting the chance to meet her and being born 20 years after her death. My due date was Elle's birthday, and I was born 3 days after. When I was younger, I was obsessed with ghosts. My dad, originating from Mexico, always had some ghost-like lore to tell me. My haunted house. Around 8 years old was when I started noticing things around my house, and it happened in a more profound way than you think. I was throwing a ball for my small dog and accidentally threw it into a corner behind a box. Me being the lazy 8-year-old, I refused to go get it and called it quits. Seconds later, my dog started violently barking as I watched her bright orange small tennis ball fly out of the corner and roll by my side. Odd, but I just tried to ignore it. My parents were hard workers, and they started their own business in 2011, which meant there were often days when me and my siblings were home alone, which wasn't an issue because my older siblings were teenagers, or just about. We loved making silly videos with our toys, and that's how we spent most of our time. However, there was one time where we were calling our landline from a cordless house phone so we could record a scene for our video. All fun and games, right? After we finished messing around with the phone, it started ringing, this time unprompted by any of us. The caller ID read back our house phone number, and we were all baffled. The number repeatedly called, and we decided to just pick it up and see what was happening. Maybe it was a glitch and our parents were trying to reach us. We picked it up, dead in silence. My brother shouted into the phone for a response, and even threatened to call the police, and still nothing. So we hung up and decided to stop recording that night. For a year after, you could hear a phone ringing, muffled and quiet as you would walk down the stairs. We tried to solve the mystery, but to no avail, and one day it just stopped ringing. There were the usual things that happened after that. A shadowy figure, the smell of Elle's perfume, a woman's voice, the sound of people walking upstairs, and orbs of light. I've never been afraid of the ghost because I've always assumed it was Elle, and I loved Elle. But something happened in my freshman year of high school that made me question if it really was her, or someone else. I was home alone cleaning and putting things away. I was in the kitchen and I had some drawers and cabinets open. My dog was outside barking up a storm, and because I didn't want the neighbours to complain, I went outside to let her in. When I came back to the door, it was locked. I banged on the glass to see if maybe someone came home and locked the door, noticing it was unlocked before, but no. I went around to the front of the house and let myself back in. When I walked in the kitchen, all the cabinets were closed. Fast forward to junior year, I opened a cabinet and took out a coffee mug to make myself a hot drink. I carried the cup to the island counter and started preparing it. Out of nowhere, a mug flies off the shelf and smashed on the kitchen floor. I asked my brother, who was sitting facing the kitchen, if he saw it, and he was shocked and said he couldn't believe what just happened. My mother rushed in to make sure everything was okay, and we explained to her what happened. Upon further examination, we noticed it was a mug my mom had just painted at one of those pottery stores. Just last week, my mother went outside and the back door locked again, with me still in the room. More active than ever. Over the summer, I became really close with a friend of mine who we'll call R. I spent a lot of time with her, and now we're best friends. I love R because she was down to do whatever crazy thing I had on my mind, and was obsessed with ghosts and true crime just as much as I am. Now, if you don't know, Jews are pretty open to spirituality. Tarot cards, crystals, the afterlife, and things of that nature. So both of us, being Jewish, decided to explore that side of our religion. We'd get tarot card readings about our love life, but it never occurred to use it to contact whoever was in my house. R had dog sat for me a couple months before and had told me about how weird my house was when she was there alone. She even called me while I was in Disneyland because of how spooked she was. She was getting ready to leave, and clear as day, she heard a woman say something to her. She was so spooked, she ran out of my house, and it took everything she had to go back alone. I wasn't the first person to tell me this or have an experience either. Every time someone house sits or dog sat for us, they have an encounter. We went to do a tarot card reader and had her do some digging for me. She used a pendant, so I was able to ask questions, all of which led me to communicating with Elle and getting reassurance. Armed with a tarot reading, pendant communication to Elle, and the courage, we purchased a spirit box. We wanted to use it, but figured since we weren't confident in it, we'd wait a bit. My parents moved my sister to another state mid-August, so I stayed with R for a few days. As R was on her way and I was packing, I heard a man speaking. I was completely freaked out because I was alone and my parents had made a comment about there being a van we'd never seen before outside. I thought someone had broken in while I was packing. I called out and got no response. I called R and had her stay on the line, and I stood in terror, ready to leave my house at a moment's notice. She came over, armed with self-defense weapons, and we went all over my house, in every room, and no one was there. I remember though, right before my family left, my mother accidentally smashed a picture frame of her and my great-great-grandmother. Elle passed away September 11th. My mom always blocked that day from her mind, before 9/11, because of her passing. But she received some information that made her question that date. Jews light a memorial candle for their loved ones on the day of their passing, and since she didn't know the date, we didn't light one. The next day, we were going out to brunch, and as we opened the door, a praying mantis was waiting for us. We thought it was so weird because we live in Arizona, and we've never seen one before. Something was nagging at me, telling me it was a sign. So I did my research and came to find out all the spiritual info about praying mantises being communicators from other dimensions. Specifically, female praying mantises bringing divine feminine energy. And if anyone knew Elle, that was her. Ever since that last month, I've just been feeling more and more connected to her. Help me make sense of it. If anyone can help me make sense of it or give me advice to communicate or figure out what or who is in my house, please let me know. My fiancé and I stayed in a cabin near the Smoky Mountains this past Saturday night for a quick getaway. I think it may have been haunted. Would love to hear what y'all think. Here's what happened. We got to the cabin around 7 p.m. Saturday. She got an off feeling when we pulled up and wanted to check out the place before we brought our stuff in, though I didn't know this was the reason at the time. Neither of us mentioned it to the other at the time, but we both felt something was a little off. It wasn't totally comfortable to be in that space. It felt at times like we were being watched. We both chalked it up to being in a remote area in a cabin with so many windows without blinds or curtains. We were also sleeping in a loft that was pretty visible throughout 3 sets of windows. We chilled in the hot tub that night after dinner. Both of us kept stealing glances inside for some reason, but still hadn't mentioned anything to one another. I kept worrying about who or what might be in the dark, just beyond my field of vision in the woods. Again, kept chalking it up to having read too much Stephen King. I found out later that she swept through the cabin while I was covering the hot tub back up because she had an uneasy feeling like someone was in the cabin. Later, when we went to bed, she was more anxious than I've ever seen her. She's intuitive as hell, so I was getting spooked too. She didn't want to freak me out with the ghost stuff, so she only mentioned out loud something about worrying about someone breaking in. I started dozing in and out eventually, and all of a sudden, she was sitting up and shining a phone's flashlight towards the wall and couch, opposite the bed. At the time, she said she had spooked herself looking at the stacked pillows. She told me later she thought she saw something over there watching us. We doze back off. She wakes up drenched in sweat and goes back to sleep. Around 3:30 a.m., were woken up by the loft's fire alarm. It beeps loudly 3 or 4 times over the course of maybe 5 or 10 seconds at most, before abruptly stopping on its own. The kitchen smoke alarm doesn't go off. We hop up, get dressed, and start turning on lights to see if we see smoke. No smoke at all, but we both smell a distinct burnt smell, like that of electrical wires that are beginning to melt. Smell goes away within 5 minutes of us being awake. Can't find any source of the smell, and it never returns. My original thought when the alarm woke us up was that someone was trying to lure us out of the house. I'd felt so uneasy and so watched since we got there. We turned on the outside lights and peeked out. No one that we can see. I'm starting to think this might be supernatural at this point, but I don't want to freak her or myself out any more than we already were. Nothing else happened, but we both felt watched and uneasy the rest of the night. We stayed awake, packed our stuff, and waited out the rest of the night downstairs. There were a few freaks and other noises, but I know cabins tend to creak a good bit since they're made of wood. I was sitting where I could see the loft, and I couldn't shake the feeling of something being up there. We got the hell out of there as soon as there was enough daylight to see our surroundings while packing the car. We later looked back at pictures of the loft and found the reflections of 2 figures in a couple of pictures. I grew up in an old village in England where the houses are 500 plus years old. The house I grew up in has a garden with a wall that borders the local graveyard, which extends all the way down to what would have been the vicar's house. 2 properties further down the road, a house and then a pub, at one point in time. When I was young, I went to school with a girl and boy that lived at the old vicar's house. At the time, the family joked that it was haunted by a ghost, and people in the village said you could sometimes see an old woman in a rocking chair in the front window. I never saw this apparition. However, I did sometimes visit the house and stayed the night, just once. It was one of the eeriest places I've ever been, especially in certain areas of the house. It's hard to describe, but even thinking of it now gives me goosebumps. The only time I ever stayed there, I woke up in total terror and had wet the bed. Bearing in mind, I would have been 10 or so. This wasn't normal at all for me at my age. I lay there totally disturbed while hearing all kinds of unsettling things. Bumps, bangs, etc. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me, I hoped. Needless to say, I made the short walk home if I ever visited again. Years went by, and the girl I knew developed a rare cancer and later died. It was very sad, and she was the first person I ever knew to die. The family continued to live there for some years and eventually moved out of the house. The for sale sign went up and a new family moved in, a man and a woman with a young daughter. The father worked in London and was arranging certain things, while the mother and daughter moved in ahead of him. Well, the first night didn't go quite to plan for the family, as the mother, carrying her daughter, ran out in the middle of the night screaming about something being in the house. She pummeled on the pub's door until someone came to comfort her, but by that time, plenty of people had heard or been woken up by her screams of what was happening. They stayed with the family running the pub that night. The following day, a rather embarrassed-looking father returned to the village, clearly unimpressed with the nonsense behaviour from his wife. But his confidence lasted a little longer than a few hours, as they got in their car and drove away in the middle of the night. Only the second night, staying in their new, haunted house. The next week, all the windows were left open and the house put up for sale again. I was told leaving the windows open was something to do with an exorcism, but I have no idea. Whatever the reason, I know I wouldn't step foot in that house now, even if he paid me. Firstly, let me say that this is all true, in all of its horror. I grew up in Ireland in the early 90s to 2000s, but I've resided in Australia for over a decade after globetrotting. That said, my siblings still recount the horror of the events and its impact on us. At the time, I had 5 brothers. We were a working class family, living in the outer Dublin suburbs in a lower socio-economic area. At that time, my father and mother, Ma and Da, decided we needed a larger house. They sold their smaller house and we moved, as I said, to a suburb which, to my 5-year-old eyes, looked like the most amazing place. But in reality, it was an average house with 4 bedrooms, 2 of which were tiny, and it was cold and had wood floors. We moved in, and it was noticed that the house was always cold. My ma was a clean freak, so it was a surprise to smell rotting eggs or other very fleeting smells. Then there was the barrel, which occurred at around 3 a.m. and was like a literal barrel flung down the stairs. Objects would also move and be found in the oddest of places. In such simple events, this is how it all started. It's funny how as kids we just believe what we're told. My ma would say, "That's just the neighbours," trying to explain away the noise, but at the time, the Richardsons, an elderly couple, lived there, so I doubt it was them. I'm not sure how much detail to add, so I'll skip quite a number of things and tell you the events which shaped my fear of the thing. I was 6 and sitting on the floor of my bedroom. Behind me were my bunk beds. The top one was my brother's. It was a huge steel bar which has clipped it in, with force to prevent a fall. To remove it, you had to lift it up with force and strength. I was sitting on the ground playing with some dolls. The bar impacted the wall in front of my head, missing me by inches. About a month later, there was a knock on the front door. I was asked to go check. As I walked towards the door, I happened to look up the stairs and saw clearly a black shadow or mass, about the same height as a human, just float down the hallway. I recall my older brother, tasked to look after me. He left me in the lounge and went upstairs to pee. We had one toilet. He called me, sounding terrified. He pointed at the frosted glass and said, "Do you see it?" We opened the window for a better look. It was like a large black bag floating around our yard, but gradually it elongated and then shortened and morphed into a kind of human shape before just flattening into the ground. These things are hard to explain because they're not normal. I recall this thought made us both feel absolutely terrified. On Halloween, when I was about 7, my brothers had the great idea to light candles in the hallway and open the front door and invite whatever spirits were lingering outside to come in. The candles flickered and blew out. About a month after this occurred, my brother, the eldest, died in a car wreck. He was a passenger and was only 17. Shortly after that, the third eldest brother told my mum that he was terrified as my brother, now deceased, had walked into his bedroom and sat on the bed. My mum, being a Catholic, wasn't perturbed by spiritual experiences, but what got her was that his eyes were dead and his mouth curled into a kind of strange smirk. I recalled a scream and some conversations about talking to a priest, but that was it. A while later, my dad, who was a complete skeptic, had his own experience. As a child, I just recall him screaming at the top of the stairs. As the story unfolded, when I was old enough, he told me that he was walking up the stairs and saw large shadows form. He felt rooted to the spot. He felt like he couldn't move. He has an overwhelming sense of fear and despair. He said that there was a thick atmosphere with a smell of smoke. He screamed and it was over. Our house was always ice cold, despite having the boiler checked. It was so cold, as kids we used to breathe out and pretend the air was cigarette smoke. The thing was always around. One night, about a year after my eldest brother passed, the second eldest had a few drinks at his Deb's, a party for high school graduates, and he went to his room. It was late. He woke us up screaming, saying he was attacked by an old man. My dad just made fun of him, like he thought my brother had one too many. I recall him checking his back and my dad's face fell. His back was scratched up and very high. They were deep. At that point, my mum turned to the church. A priest came and took us all individually to question us. That's when it came to light that my second eldest brother had a spirit board hidden behind his wardrobe, which he and his friends had used. My mum was livid. The priest confirmed through investigation of a demonic presence. This was really just the start of it, to be honest. I grew up on the island of Guam for the first 17 years of my life. My family moved from the Philippines, and Guam was home for the time I was there. Coming from the Philippines, I was exposed to all kinds of myths and legends. The country was exposed to Spanish and American colonialism for several hundred years, and with it came alongside the respective myths and legends. Catholicism was brought along and amplified the local legends and myths, and quickly took root in the culture of the Philippines. I'm going to go off on a tangent. Southeast Asian ghost stories are by far the most terrifying thing that has graced my imagination. Half man, half horse demons, witches that kidnap the young, vampires living among you, and ancestral spirits that wandered the jungles, making sure you paid your respects. Guam was no different and was subject to the changes and mixtures brought along by colonialism. One such myth was the legend of the White Lady. You can find legends of a lady dressed in a white around the globe. The stories are often based on a tragic incident such as suicide, miscarriage, and murder of a lover. The white flowing dress symbolises the purity and innocence of the ghost despite her demeanour. The Guam legend goes along the lines of this. This legend dates back to the late 1600s. A dashing romantic Spanish officer pursued and courted a beautiful daughter of a prominent Chamorro family. Proud and happy for their daughter, the parents gave her permission to marry the officer. After the couple came back from their honeymoon, they settled in the village of Mena. In the beginning, the couple was happy, but the Spaniard's attitude began to change. Soon, he began to expect his wife to wait on him. He became demanding and abusive. There was a river not far from their home, and the water was fresh, pure, and sweet. He ordered his wife to fetch him water from this river every day. Finding it a relief to be away from her husband, the wife used this time as a happy and secret ritual. She took her time enjoying the serenity of the flowers and bamboo trees surrounding the river. She especially treasured the time she was at the river when there was a full moon. One day, she lost track of time and took longer when fetching the water. Her husband became angry and wanted to punish her. One stormy night, he commanded her to get water. The wind was blowing hard, the rain poured heavily, and the whole land was in total darkness. Because of the weather, she had a difficult time finding her way to the river. Not realizing she was near the riverbank, she walked right into soft, wet soil, when suddenly she felt herself pulled into the river with great force. The water was whirling and turbulent. It wrapped her with intense, raging force. She screamed, but no one heard her. The husband became so angry when she didn't come home that he immediately took off to look for her. Other villagers also went. The officer saw the aftermath of the storm and the still flooding river waters. He realized what happened and what he had done. His wife's body was never found, and the Spaniard became repentant, grieved for his wife, and died lonely not long afterwards. One night, I was driving out of my neighbourhood to head to basketball practice. The neighbourhood was surrounded by a thick jungle and a narrow, winding road. The road is dark and moonlight doesn't penetrate the thick leaves and foliage. Small houses flanked the winding portion of the road, and occasionally they'd light the surrounding darkness. The last turn before hitting the main road was the darkest part. You couldn't see beyond the corner, and you'd often be surprised by crossing bulls, deer, and people wandering that street. The one night I turned that corner, my blood froze. There she was, the lady in a white dress. Barefoot, long black hair, and a long, flowing white dress. I was terrified and shocked. I wasn't sure what to do. I slammed the brakes and stared at her, and she stared back at me. Seconds after we stared at each other, I recognized her. She was one of the girls who lived in the houses outside of my neighborhood. I was relieved. This is more or less an urban legend based on true events. When a member disappears, the first concern is the safety of said member. This story takes place at Travis Air Force Base, California. It's a massive Air Force base that belongs to the Air Mobility Command. AMC is responsible for transporting cargo, fuel, and personnel across the Air Force. It's a relatively high-tempo base compared to some of the other bases around the US. The story revolves around an airman that didn't show up to work one day. It wasn't necessarily just a one-time occurrence either. This man had a history of not showing up on time and just refusing to show up. The one time he didn't show up, he was contacted, but to no avail. Multiple phone calls led to nowhere, and eventually, his supervisor and first sergeant, think kind of like military human resources, showed up to his dormitory room. There was no one to answer the door, and the next step was to enter forcefully. There was no sign of struggle or apparent suicide. His vehicle was still in the parking lot, and his keys were still in the dormitory. A few weeks pass, and eventually, they give up on the search and declare him as AWOL. Then the new guy shows up. He eventually takes over the AWOL airman's dormitory. Life is normal for the most part, with the exception of a few odd occurrences. He notices things being moved after he returns from work. The experiences he had are mild, and initially he brushes them off. It only gets far more aggressive as time goes on. It gets to the point that what little furniture he has starts being shifted after he returns from work. It's not just the little things like a cup or his nightstand shifting. It's his mattress, his bed, and his food stuffed in the refrigerator. It escalates, and the airman reports hearing voices in the middle of the night while he's trying to sleep. The voice often attacks his character or his self-esteem, to the point it tells him to kill himself. The airman doesn't get much sleep anymore and ends up being late to work on several occasions. He tells his supervisor this and swears up and down that his dormitory is haunted. His supervisor entertains this idea and visits his room. Nothing is heard from the supervisor, but the airman swears up and down this is the case. Eventually, he gets sent to the shrink for mental evaluation to see if he's fit for service. He gets diagnosed with schizophrenia or something along those lines. He gets medicated and sent to inpatient psychiatry. He eventually goes through a medical evaluation board to figure out if they should kick him out. The first sergeant went back to his room to gather some of his belongings per his request. Lo and behold, guess who's sitting on his bed? The airman that went AWOL eating a sandwich he helped himself to. Turns out he lived in the drop towel ceiling the entire time and would talk in the middle of the night to the new guy. It's the house I grew up in. Me, my brother and my mother are convinced that the house is haunted. My father doesn't believe in ghosts. So growing up, odd things happened. When I was little, I was convinced that there was something in my room. I could always hear something, sometimes even steps in my room. One day, a ball fell down from the attic at around 11 p.m., even though it was nowhere near the stairs. I sometimes heard movement in the hallway even though no one was there. Once, I saw a blue orb in the attic. I'm still confused about that. Recently, my brother revealed that he always felt like there was someone in his room. He sometimes saw a black mass in one specific corner of his room, but only when the lights were out. So my brother and I both moved out a few years ago, and now my parents live alone in their house. Some weeks, my mother hears all kinds of noises from all over the house when she's alone in the evening. My father sometimes works night shifts. When that happens, she closes the door, turns the TV louder, and keeps her dog close. Once she was home alone, and she could hear my father open the front door with his keys, close it, and take off his shoes. Except, no one came home. She waited for my father to come to her and say hello, but he didn't come home for a few more hours. A few weeks ago, my father went to take a shower while my mom was busy doing housework. My dad should have been in the shower already when my mom saw him go by the door towards the kitchen. She was confused but didn't think much of it. except when she saw no one was in the kitchen. She checked the bathroom and my father had indeed been showering already. She should have seen him come by the door again had he gone into the kitchen and back to the shower. She asked my dad, and he confirmed that he had been showering for a few minutes already. It's weird, because the odd stuff happens in phases. Some weeks or months, nothing happens at all. Other times, the house has a creepy vibe to it and odd stuff happens. Mostly weird noises like footsteps. Why would a ghost seemingly mimic my father? The parents built the house and no one has died there. My brother died 14 years ago, but odd stuff happened even before then, I think. Does anyone else have similar stories? And why is it seemingly part-time haunted? In my life, I've always had weird paranormal experiences. I've seen and heard things that were very difficult to explain. And I've also experienced these things with other people present, seeing them as well. So I felt these times that I'm not going crazy, and something weird has actually happened. I'm not sure what ghosts are, if they're dead people or something else, but I believe there's something around us that we can't fully sense. Anyway, apart from all the weird shadows, noises, and ghost-like things I've experienced, there's one memory that still keeps me up at night today. 10 years ago, I was about 12, just chilling at home after school. It was summer and sunny outside in the middle of the day. You know, people walking in the streets and just a normal day. I went to take the trash out. I need to explain the scenery a little bit, just to make it clearer how weird this experience was. Our house was on a long road, full of houses on each side of the street. When you walked out the door from our house, you could see clearly to both ends of the street. No trees or any bushes or anything like that to hide behind. Anyway, when I went out to take the trash containers were like 100 meters away down the street. I started walking and I saw a man walking down the street, just about 10 meters next to me. I shit you not, this guy had pure white hair, a very shiny white suit, golden shoes, and a golden walking stick. And everything about him was kind of shiny, for lack of a better word. I saw him, thought to myself, oh, a pretty cool suit, kind of weird, and just kept walking. But then it hit me how weirdly out of place he looked, so I took a second look just seconds after the first one, and he's nowhere to be found. Just vanished. Puff. And for a reminder, the street was wide, no trees, no bushes, or no corners to hide behind. Absolutely nowhere to hide in seconds. And he was walking in the middle of the walkway, in the middle of the day. When I realised what I had seen and he had disappeared, I just stood there in awe and freaking out. I went back inside and asked my family if anyone else saw him or had ever seen him in the neighbourhood. Nobody knew what I was talking about, of course, because what the fuck was it? For a better comparison, he looked a lot like Colonel Sanders, but not exactly. The white hair and suit was similar, but the shiny golden shoes and the golden walking cane were very out of place. So my question is, was I just losing my mind? Or what the hell did I exactly see that day? I'd also love to hear if anyone has ever seen a similar apparition or entity, or whatever it was, that walked down the street that day. And after that, I've never seen anything like that in my life ever again. First, let me preface this by saying that I've never felt anything weird here. Nothing malicious, playful, friendly, nothing. It just feels like an apartment. I live alone on the top floor. I also have no adjoining walls with any neighbours. For the past few weeks, I've heard random crashing coming from different areas of my apartment. This always happens at night, but not always when I'm asleep or in bed. I can be watching TV and will hear plates and other glassware rattling in the cupboards. I also don't live near any major roads or train tracks or anything. So these aren't large trucks or trains passing by. Upon investigating the noise, I never see anything there, but sometimes I see that doors or cupboards are opened or closed. Closets and bathroom doors will also open or close on their own as well. Since I live alone, I don't close my bedroom door so that my cat can come and go as he wants. At least once a week, I'll come home from work and my bedroom door will be shut tight. My cat can't move it. I've seen him try. He's also never closed in the room, so I know that it isn't him. I'll be in my computer room, which is my spare bedroom, and leave to get a drink or food or something. When I come back in, the closet will be wide open. The closet is empty, so I have no reason to ever open it myself. Sometimes when I'm in bed, but not always asleep, this can happen if I'm just looking at my phone or something, I feel the pressure on the bed. It feels as if my cat jumped on the bed and is standing at the bottom. The pressure slowly moves up step by step until it's near me and then stops completely. The springs in my mattress compress a bit and squeak slightly when this happens. My cat never reacts to any of this, so it's hard to tell if this is all in my imagination or not. Last night, I woke up at exactly 3:12. I heard a young woman shout the word pack directly in my ear. It might have been sleep paralysis or something similar, but this time my cat shot straight up and stared into the darkness. None of this has felt particularly threatening or scary, but it's unnerving to say the least. I've never had experiences in my own home before, so I'm a bit spooked. Any help or similar stories are appreciated. In 1896, local miners discovered gold in the Klondike region of Yukon in northwest Canada. The news hit Seattle and San Francisco, and then a stampede of prospects descended on the area looking for wealth. Over 100,000 people with gold fever rushed into Klondike in only 3 short years. Most of them got a whole bunch of nothing for their trouble. Many places went through drastic changes during that time. A town in Alaska named Skagway saw its population balloon from a few hundred to over 30,000 people. If the name sounds familiar, you may have heard it from The Call of the Wind by Jack London, Will Hobbs's book Jason's Gold by Will Hobbs, Guardian by Joe Haldeman, or even North to Alaska, starring John Wayne. Nearly every building in Skagway has a story to tell and clear links to the Klondike Gold Rush past. One building in particular, the Red Onion Saloon, has an odd history, and visitors claim a resident ghost. It opened for business in 1898 as a dance hall, saloon, and bordello at the height of the gold rush. It was considered Alaska's most exclusive bordello and was even built by planks cut by the founder of Skagway, Captain William Moore. It only operated for 2 years as a prospector's attention moved onto the Nome Gold Rush in 1899. Oh, how fickle those prospectors were. After closing up when the Klondike Gold Rush ended, the building hosted all sorts of businesses. During World War II, it was a barracks for soldiers. Later, it spent time as a laundry business, a bakery, union hall, a television station, and a gift shop. The building was kind of slapped together, and when so many people began to move to Skagway, the owner decided to move it 4 blocks closer to the rail depot to attract more customers. They hoisted it up onto rolling logs and pushed it with a single horse and crew of men. Once the building was placed in a new spot, the team realized they had the whole thing backward. Instead of rolling it down to face the other way, they just sawed off the front and back, and switched them, and nailed the whole thing back together. Genius. The cut lines are still visible today. I really do wonder why it was easier to cut the front and back off and swap them, instead of spin the building around, but unfortunately, I couldn't find anything about it. The 2-story building had a saloon and dance hall on the first floor, and the brothel up the stairway to heaven on the second floor. Men would come into the saloon, head over to the bar, and find $10 on display, each representing a woman working at the time. If the doll was lying down, the woman was busy with another customer. If the doll was standing up, then $5 in gold would buy 15 minutes of a time. Interested buyers would select a doll and head upstairs to meet the woman in one of the crib rooms. He'd pay the woman and she'd drop the gold down a copper tube system into a safety deposit box. The whole business was overseen by a madam and a crew of bouncers. Only around 8% of the total population of Klondike during the gold rush were women. In Skagway, there was a high turnover rate of prostitutes, and there were about 300 serving over 15,000 men. Skagway was a lawless town, described as little better than hell on earth by the Northwest Mounted Police. A con artist and gangster named Soapy Smith operated a ring of thieves, a spy network, and a private militia. He also controlled the local newspaper and the Deputy US Marshal's office. As you might imagine, it wasn't really a friendly place for anyone, but especially for women. While some travelled to the area for the work, others found it their only option to make enough to survive, or make enough to get out of Alaska. Each of those crib rooms and Red Onion Saloon's brothel had several doors if the women working needed a quick escape from a bad situation. Today, there's a resident ghost or two who you can hear roaming upstairs, her footsteps falling on the still original hardwood floors. There are conflicting reports and plenty of misinformation about the ghostly activity at Red Onion Saloon, so I've only included things that I've been able to verify in reports directly from current or former employees. Lydia's ghost. A relatively friendly ghost made an appearance to an employee years ago. She showed up as a translucent figure in the corner of her room upstairs. The figure had marks on her face that resembled what untreated syphilis might do. The disease was a considerable risk for sex workers, and the first effective treatment wasn't developed until 1909. Lydia has been known to employees for many years, and staff believe her to be friendly, at least to women. She wanders the building, watering plants, caressing faces, and leaving the scent of freshly cut lilacs behind. The room she appeared in often has mysterious cold spots, and guests continually take photos that show white blurs, orbs, and occasionally even the faint outline of her face. It's unclear precisely how people know her name, but as these things go, the name Lydia has been passed on to new staff throughout the years. As for the cause of her death, the commonly accepted theory is that she contracted syphilis and took her own life by hanging herself in the corner of the room where she's sometimes seen. Lydia may or not be friendly toward men. There's another ghost in the building that isn't often spoken about, and it may be responsible for the unfriendly interactions with men, and possibly others. John's ghost. Watch out for yourself if you ever find yourself up in Skagway in the Red Onion Saloon. There's a malevolent male ghost that employees call John. He roams the place, causing no end of trouble for the staff and sometimes guests. You'll know he's around if you catch a whiff of horrendous body odour, or if he decides to simply shove you down a flight of stairs. He'll also fling open doors of rooms staff while they're changing. The story among employees is that John is a former bouncer who was stabbed to death by a prostitute who got fed up with his constant harassment. Today, Red Onion Saloon is a restaurant and museum, complete with guided tours. It's open from about April through September, as the building is not well insulated and quite cold in the winter months. You'll find a collection of bedpans decorating the restaurant's walls and pizza on the menu. There's a good selection of Alaskan beer as well. For a small fee, you can get a quickie tour, or for a bit more, you can go on the Ghost and Good Time Girls Walking Tour, where you'll wander the streets, back alleys, and old red light districts of Skagway, learning about historic characters like Soapy Smith, Skookum Jim, and Klondike Kate. Of course, your guide will be a well-dressed and good-humoured madam, and you'll end with champagne and a tour of the brothel museum. I'm really into all things spooky, and was thinking about trying a Ouija board. I wanted to make sure I didn't mess anything up, so I spent the whole day just researching it. That night, when I went to sleep, I woke up at 3 a.m. I woke up at least one time in the middle of the night every night, so I don't think anything of it. But whenever I closed my eyes, I kept having the strangest visualization. As soon as I closed my eyes, it was like I was above my headboard looking down on myself, sleeping. And on the left side of my bed, there were these two shadow-looking people standing over myself in the bed. I immediately opened my eyes and looked, and of course nothing was there. But whenever I closed my eyes, the next couple times it was the same thing. I haven't seen anything like that since that night, but I still remember clearly what the scene was. Is that what astral projection is? Or could that just be a dream? The reason it feels like it wasn't a dream was that I immediately saw it once I closed my eyes. Usually it'll be black until I start dreaming, but it didn't feel like a dream. I can tell you that myself in the bed did not see what I was seeing, and did not know they were there. Also, do you think that they were two negative beings coming to me because I'd spent all day surrounding my mind with the paranormal? Or do you think that it was two positive beings kind of trying to warn me not to mess with the board and scared me by accident?